The Cruelest Side of American Slavery, 1865. Imagine for a moment that you wake up tomorrow morning and your 7-year-old daughter is no longer there, not because she ran away, not because something terrible happened, but because someone sold her. Someone who legally owned her as property. You will never see her again, never know where she is, never know if she's alive or dead. This is not a hypothetical terror scenario. This was the daily reality for millions of enslaved people in the United States for 246 years. And here's what nobody tells you. When the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was officially abolished, millions of newly freed black people began a desperate search, looking for mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters who had been ripped from them decades before. Some searched for 50 years. Many died without ever finding their loved ones. Today we're going to dive into the cruelest, most devastating, most dehumanizing aspect of American slavery, the systematic destruction of the black family. And I'm warning you now, this story is going to break your heart, but you need to hear it. Before we continue, if you want real American history unfiltered without convenient lies, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn never appeared in your school textbooks, and you need to know this. Subscribe now. Let's start with some numbers that are going to shock you. Historians estimate that between 1788, when the importation of slaves from Africa was prohibited, and 1865, when slavery ended, approximately 2 million enslaved people were sold in the domestic slave trade. 2 million. And here's the devastating detail. Most of these sales separated families, mothers from children, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters, children from parents. It wasn't an accidental side effect of the system, it was a central feature. Enslavers separated families intentionally, strategically, because enslaved children were worth money, because young and strong workers were worth more without the burden of families, because keeping families together gave enslaved people something to fight for, something to resist for. Destroying families broke spirits, and broken spirits were easier to control. Here's something few people know. In the 1850s, the decade before the Civil War, 1 in 3 marriages between enslaved people ended not by death, but by forced sale. 1 in 3. Imagine being married, raising children together, building a life within the horrible confines of slavery, and then one day your spouse is sold to a plantation in Mississippi, and you're in Virginia, 1,500 kilometers away. No phones, no letters for people who can't read and write, no means of communication, just silence for the rest of your lives. And this didn't happen rarely. It happened constantly, systematically. It was so common there was a term for it, sold down river. Being sold down river, usually to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, was the constant terror of every enslaved person in the Upper South states, because everyone knew what it meant. It meant never seeing your family again. And the children. My God, the children. Historians estimate that between 1/4 and 1/3 of all enslaved children were separated from their parents before age 14. Think about that. 1/3. That means if you walked through a plantation in 1850, 1 in every 3 children you saw would eventually be ripped from their mother or father and sold away. And the age at which this happened will destroy you. Children were regularly sold starting at 8, 9, 10 years old, sometimes younger. There are documented records of children 5, 6 years old being sold alone, 5 years old, ripped from their mothers and sent alone to unknown places, to work for strangers, never to see their families again. Try to imagine the trauma, the terror, the pain of a mother who wakes up one morning and her child is simply no longer there. Sold during the night to a slave trader. Can you imagine that horror? I'm going to tell you a specific story because numbers can be abstract, but stories are real. In 1848, an enslaved woman named Rose was sold from Virginia to South Carolina. She had a 9-year-old daughter named Ashley. Rose begged, cried, offered to do anything if they could stay together. The buyer said no. Rose was chained and forced to march 300 kilometers away while Ashley was left behind. Before leaving, Rose managed to give Ashley a small cloth sack. Inside were 3 handfuls of pecans, a lock of Rose's hair, and a dress Rose had sewn. And Rose told Ashley, then 9 years old, "This is so you remember me. Ashley kept that sack for the rest of her life, 96 years. Never saw her mother again, never knew where Rose went, never knew if she survived. That sack, now in a museum, is all that remained of their relationship. This is not an ancient, abstract story. This is real human pain, real generational trauma, and this happened millions of times. Now here's something that will shock you. Marriages between enslaved people were not legally recognized, zero legal protection. You could have a ceremony, jump over a broom in the African-American tradition, live as husband and wife for 20 years, have 10 children together, and legally it meant absolutely nothing. Your owner could sell you tomorrow, and the law recognized no right of your spouse or children to remain with you. Enslaved women were often raped by white men, forced to have children who also became the property of the rapists. And if an enslaved woman was married, she had no legal recourse. Her husband had no legal recourse. Children born from these violations belonged to the rapist. That was the law. Imagine the helplessness. Imagine watching your wife be violated and being able to do absolutely nothing because the law doesn't recognize your marriage, doesn't recognize your humanity, doesn't recognize your right to protect your family. And here's another dimension of cruelty that's rarely discussed. Enslavers used the threat of family separation as a control tool. If you resisted, your daughter would be sold. If you tried to escape and were captured, your children would be sold as punishment. If you complained about working conditions, your husband would be sent away. It was constant psychological terrorism. Every enslaved person lived with the knowledge that any act of defiance could result in the destruction of their family. And enslavers did this deliberately. There are preserved letters from plantation owners discussing strategies to manage enslaved people, and family separation is explicitly mentioned as an effective control tool. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it for 246 years. Let me give you more context about how the slave trade worked, because understanding the mechanics makes the horror even more real. There were professional slave traders who traveled throughout the South buying and selling human beings. They set up slave depots in major cities like Richmond, Charleston, New Orleans. These places were exactly what they sound like, warehouses where human beings were kept as merchandise waiting to be sold. Families were separated there. Mothers holding babies were forced to climb onto auction platforms while auctioneers shouted bids. Children crying for their mothers were ripped away and sold to the highest bidder. And here's the detail that will make you sick. Auctioneers often advertised sales of fancy Negroes, that was the term used, meaning young children separated from their mothers, sold alone because they were easier to train without parental influence. This is not language I'm inventing. This is in actual newspaper advertisements from 1840, 1850. Sale of fancy Negroes ages 8 to 14, no family. Commercializing orphaned children as a sales advantage, and then came 1865. The Civil War ends. The 13th Amendment is ratified. 4 million people are declared free, and one of the first things millions of them do is start searching for mothers sold 30 years ago, for brothers sold in childhood, for wives, husbands, children lost to the slave trade. Black newspapers across the country began publishing advertisements, information wanted, and these ads will break your heart. Looking for my mother, Hannah, sold from Virginia to Mississippi around 1835. She would be about 60 now. Looking for my 3 children, sold in Richmond in 1852. Names were Peter, Mary, and Samuel. Looking for my husband, Ben, sold from Charleston to New Orleans in 1849. Thousands of these ads, thousands of people searching for ghosts. And here's the devastating part. Most never found their loved ones. How do you find someone when you don't know their last name because enslaved people didn't have official surnames, when you can't read or write, when there are no records because enslavers didn't keep detailed documentation of family sales, when 30 years have passed and people changed names, moved, died? It was nearly impossible, but they tried. God, how they tried. There are documented stories of people who walked hundreds of kilometers on foot, visiting every plantation along the way, asking if anyone knew their mother, their child, their brother. People who saved every penny for years to pay investigators to search. People who searched for decades. Some got lucky, most didn't. Let me tell you about the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency created in 1865 to help newly freed people in the transition. One of its functions was to help reunite families. They had records of thousands of requests. Please help me find my daughter. Please help me find my mother. And they tried. But without a centralized database, without modern communication, it was nearly impossible. There were 4 million newly freed people scattered across 15 states. How do you find one specific person? Some families were reunited. Most were not. And when the Freedmen's Bureau was dissolved in 1872, many of these searches simply ended. Now here's something profound you need to understand. This trauma of family separation didn't end when slavery ended. It echoed through generations. Children who grew up without knowing their parents passed this trauma to their own children. The inability to trust family structures, the constant fear of loss, the knowledge that your family could be destroyed at any moment, this became part of the collective memory. And then came the foster care system, which disproportionately removed black children from families. And then came mass incarceration, which separates black fathers from their children at epidemic rates. Family separation as a tool of control over the black population didn't end with slavery. It just changed form. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now because we're going to connect all these dots in future videos. Hit that subscribe button. Let me give you one more specific example that shows the scale of this trauma. After slavery ended, black churches throughout the South began keeping memory books, where people recorded information about lost family members. Some of these books survived. One book from a church in Charleston has over 300 entries. 300 people from a single congregation searching for family members. That was just one church. Multiply that by thousands of churches throughout the South, and you begin to comprehend the magnitude. Every black family in America had been touched by forced separation. Every single family, there is not a single exception. And here's something nobody teaches you. When families were separated during slavery, they often created fictive families. Not fictive in the sense of false, but fictive in the sense of chosen rather than biological. Enslaved people on the same plantation became family to each other. They cared for each other's children. They called older women aunt and older men uncle, even without blood relation. This was a survival strategy, a way to create family structure when your biological family had been ripped away. And when freedom came, many people maintained these chosen families, continued calling each other aunt, uncle, brother, sister, because these people helped them survive hell. This tradition of chosen family, of calling close friends family, still exists in African American culture today. It's a direct legacy of biological families being systematically destroyed for 246 years. Now I want to focus on something specific. What happened to children sold alone? Because this is perhaps the purest form of cruelty. Imagine you're an 8-year-old child. You wake up one morning and a stranger grabs you. You're crying for your mother. Nobody cares. You're put in a wagon or train with 20, 30 other children, all crying, all terrified. You travel for days, weeks. You arrive at a completely strange place. People you've never seen are now your owners. You don't know where you are. You don't know where your mother went. You're 8 years old and you're completely alone in the world. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of children experienced exactly this. Tens of thousands. And most never saw their mothers again. Never knew what happened to their families, grew up without any connection to their roots, their history, their identity. And here's the final legacy we need to confront. When you systematically destroy the black family for 246 years, when you make it impossible for parents to protect children, when you sell children away from mothers, when you rape women and enslave the offspring, when you refuse legal recognition to marriages, you create trauma that persists for generations. And then when freedom finally comes, and you offer no reparations, no assistance in reuniting families, no acknowledgement of what was done, you ensure that this trauma continues. The black American family was attacked for centuries, first by slavery, then by black codes and Jim Crow, then by housing discrimination that destroyed black neighborhoods, then by the war on drugs that mass-incarcerated black fathers, then by the foster care system that disproportionately removes black children. The destruction of the black family was not a historical accident. It was deliberate policy for 4 centuries, and we're still living with the consequences. So when you hear statistics about single-parent families in black communities, when you hear about broken family structure, you need to understand the context. Understand that the United States government and private white citizens spent 246 years forcibly separating black families, and then another 150 years creating policies that continued this pattern. You cannot systematically destroy families for 4 centuries and then blame those communities for weak family structure. It's obscene, it's dishonest, and it completely ignores the real history. Let me end with one final story because I think it captures everything. In 1890, 25 years after the end of slavery, a 75-year-old woman named Emily placed an ad in a black newspaper. She was looking for her daughter, who had been sold away from her in 1844 when the girl was 3 years old. 46 years of searching. Emily eventually found her daughter. They reunited when Emily was 76 and her daughter 49. They had spent 46 years separated, almost half a century. They recovered only a few years together before Emily died. Think about what was stolen from them. Think about all the memories they never had. Think about the entire lifetime of mother-daughter relationship that was denied them. And then multiply that story by millions, because this happened millions of times. That is the true legacy of American slavery. Destroyed families, ruined lives, trauma that persists to this day. Slavery wasn't just about forced labor. It wasn't just about physical violence. It was about the systematic destruction of black humanity, and nothing was more dehumanizing than ripping children from mothers, husbands from wives, brothers from brothers. If you learned anything today, if this story touched you, subscribe to this channel now, share this video, because these stories need to be told, these truths need to be known, and we're going to keep telling them, no matter how painful they are. See you in the next video.